Hello, everyone, and welcome to Human Trafficking. Today, we're going to start with Lecture 1, What is Human Trafficking, Myth versus Reality? You'll notice in Module 1 that you have access to this PowerPoint so that you can open it up and take notes as we go along, as well as this lecture. So if anybody has any questions along the way, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. You can also pose any questions that you have in the discussion board, and I'll be going through all of those, and I'm happy to put in an answer there for you as well. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So today, what we'll be talking about is human trafficking, myth versus reality. So we're going to go through some of the basics of human trafficking. We're also going to talk about some common myths that perpetuate this global phenomenon. Then we're going to talk about human trafficking here in the US. And then we will talk about human trafficking here in the state of South Carolina, as well as within Charleston County. And lastly, we will talk about the effects that COVID-19 had on human trafficking. So let's dive right in. So the first thing I want to talk about is, should we really be referring to human trafficking as modern day slavery? Even though slavery was abolished in the US in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't end there. Even after Reconstruction, after the Civil War, 2 years later, slavery still lingered. In fact, almost 100 years after the passage of the 13th Amendment, the US courts were still discussing slavery. For instance, in the 1947 case, US versus Ingalls, the courts officially defined a slave as a person in a state of enforced or extorted servitude to another. And importantly, they included psychological coercion as a way of keeping a slave compliant within that definition. Then 40 years later, in the case US versus Kaminsky, 1988, the Supreme Court removed psychological coercion as one of the means or ways of keeping a slave compliant. This ruling made it a lot harder to prosecute human traffickers when you limit the means of keeping a slave compliant to physical or legal coercion or fraud. Later in the semester, we'll discuss how common it is to use psychological coercion to keep a victim compliant. This ruling stood until 2000, when the US passed their first federal law on human trafficking with the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, known as the TVPA, which added psychological manipulation or psychological coercion back into the definition. So the first question I posed is this really modern day slavery? That phrase implies that it's something new, something that's perhaps reemerged after a dormant period. But really, it has existed all along, just kind of hidden in plain sight. Even though every nation in the world has laws abolishing slavery, the International Labor Organization estimates that 21 million men, women, and children are being exploited on any given day. But the Global Slavery Index says the number is closer to 45 million. 2/3 of our victims come from the Asian Pacific region, and slavery has been identified in every country in the world. And human trafficking generates substantial profits for the traffickers, about $150 billion per year, which means anywhere from $3,900 to $35,000 per victim. So really the question is this modern day slavery, or is this something that has been continuing throughout our nation? So getting into the myths of human trafficking, the first myth is that human trafficking does not happen in the US. In reality, human trafficking has been here since the founding of our country and continues to do so. Human trafficking cases have been reported in all 50 states, and I would wager a guess that it's occurring in almost every community in the US. Human trafficking is the sexual exploitation of young women and girls. That's the next myth. In fact, most of the early human trafficking legislation focused on preventing forced prostitution of women and girls. Think of the movie Taken. However, victims of sexual exploitation only make up a small portion of the human trafficking victims. Human trafficking involves a broad range of exploitive practices, not limited to sexual exploitation. Other types of trafficking that we'll get into later in the semester include things like labor trafficking, organ trafficking, forced and child marriage, as well as child soldiering. The next myth is that all human trafficking victims are kidnapped by strangers. Most human trafficking victims are not kidnapped by strangers or any sort of secret syndicate. Instead, it's often their neighbor, their relative, their romantic partner, or other acquaintances who exploit them. This is very similar to other types of crime in which you're more likely to be victimized by someone you know as opposed to a stranger. Traffickers often use fraudulent, psychologically manipulative, or coercive recruitment tactics so that they don't need to kidnap or even physically restrain their victims. The next myth is that human trafficking requires the movement of victims. Trafficking does not require a movement. This is a tough myth to correct because the word trafficking implies movement. The central concern when you're talking about human trafficking is the exploitation of someone. That is the essence of human trafficking, that you are exploiting a human or specifically exploiting one of their vulnerabilities. That is what trafficking is about. Moving someone is just but one way that you can help facilitate this exploitation. Traffickers can use transportation to facilitate this crime, and it's pretty common because moving the victim around constantly helps them avoid detection by law enforcement. In addition, it helps to make the victim feel more isolated when they can't put down roots. It's not uncommon for a victim, when they've finally been discovered, to not even know what city, state, or town that they are currently in, just because they've been moved so much. There are many other ways that trafficking can occur without transportation, and we'll get into that later in the semester. The last myth that we're going to cover on this slide is that human trafficking requires physical bondage. Trafficking does not require physical bondage. Just like transportation, it's but one way to facilitate trafficking, but it's not a requirement. Other ways traffickers can control their victims are through threats or the use of force, through coercing them, through deception. A lot of times they will abuse their vulnerability. For instance, they'll get them addicted to drugs, or they'll find someone that is addicted to drugs and then withhold that fix unless they do what they're asking them to do or forcing them to do. They can also threaten their children or other members of their family. The next myth that we're going to cover is that human trafficking and human smuggling are the same thing. Trafficking is distinct from migrant smuggling. Human smuggling or migrant smuggling refers to a violation of a nation's laws about illegal entry and is often performed with the consent of the individual that is being smuggled. The key takeaway here is that those being smuggled usually give permission, consent, or even pay their smuggler, and their intention is to be smuggled into a foreign country. On the other hand, trafficking victims are not consenting, they are not paying to be smuggled or even moved. Lastly, the relationship between the smuggler and the client ends as soon as they get them across the border, and that is often where a trafficker can regain control over them. So a lot of times people will agree to be smuggled into a country, and then the trafficker will take over from there. And the trafficker will regain control of them or pass them off to someone who takes their travel documents and then traffics them for other purposes. Which leads nicely into the next myth. Human trafficking cannot occur if the victim initially gives consent. That is not true. Human trafficking can take place even if the victim initially consented to providing labor services, to being smuggled, or even agrees to providing commercial sex acts. What we're focusing on here is the trafficker's conduct, not the victim's conduct. It doesn't matter what the victim did in the beginning. We are interested in what the trafficker did. A trafficker can and does target victims after they apply for jobs, after they migrate, or if they agree to commercial sex. What matters here is the trafficker's coercive scheme, not a victim's prior consent or the ability to meaningfully consent thereafter. The next myth is that human trafficking victims always know they are a victim and they want help. Many human trafficking victims do not self-identify as a victim or don't even seek help. Sometimes they feel ashamed or guilty, or a lot of times they don't even understand they're being trafficked due to the coercion or the web of lies they're being told by their trafficker. Or sometimes a victim can develop a sort of Stockholm syndrome known as trauma bonding, which we'll talk about more throughout the semester. The next myth is that human trafficking victims are all foreign national females. The reality is that anyone can be a human trafficking victim. It affects people in every country, every race, every socioeconomic background. It is a widespread crime that generates about $150 billion worldwide per year. Traffickers and their victims are diverse and they do not fit one stereotype. Trafficking victims can be males or they can be females, and the same thing applies to their traffickers. The last myth that we're going to talk about is that all human trafficking victims are moral, law-abiding citizens. This is what is known as the ideal victim narrative, which was a concept defined by Niles Christie in 1986. The ideal victim narrative is the victim is defined as a weak person in comparison to the offender. The ideal victim is always engaged in morally sound, ordinary, everyday behavior when they are trafficked. Additionally, the human trafficking victim does not have a criminal record. This is all in juxtaposition to the ideal perpetrator, who is this big bad person who has taken advantage of this morally sound, law-abiding citizen. All of this makes it seem like the victim is weak and naive and blameless, which reinforces this ideal victim narrative, which we know is not representative of most victims of human trafficking. Many victims of human trafficking have criminal records, are drug addicts, or are sex workers. Let's talk about human trafficking in the US. So human traffickers exploit domestic and foreign national victims here in the US, and traffickers exploit victims from the United States abroad. Human trafficking cases have been reported in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and US territories. Here in the US, we have a federal trafficking law, the TVPA, which I mentioned previously, and all 50 states have their own state-level anti-trafficking legislation. Talking about the federal legislation, the TVPA of 2000, federally we recognize two forms of trafficking: forced labor and forced sex. As you can see in these definitions across the top, a victim does not need to be physically transported from one location to another for the crime to fall within the definition by the TVPA standards. In addition, if you look at all of those verbs across the top of that definition, that allows prosecutors to go after anyone within the trafficking organization. The three elements that are required in order for something to be considered one of these two forms of trafficking, forced sex or forced labor, the three things you have to consider are the acts, the means, and the purpose. Those are the three things that a prosecutor has to prove that someone is a human trafficker. Starting with the acts, this refers to the role the trafficker played. Did they recruit someone, harbor, transport, provide, or obtain someone for some sort of forced labor or sex? The means refers to how this trafficker was able to make the victim do what they wanted to do, and usually falls into one of three categories: force, fraud, or coercion. So coercion can include things like threats of force, debt manipulation, withholding of pay, confiscation of identity documents, so on and so forth. And lastly, the purpose. This refers to the type of trafficking that they engaged in. Was it forced labor, sex, organ trafficking, child and forced marriage, so on and so forth. Here in the US, trafficking victims have been found in so many industries, including but not limited to hospitality, traveling sales crews, agriculture, janitorial services, construction, landscaping, restaurants, factories, salon services, massage parlors, retail services, fairs and carnivals, peddling and begging, religious institutions, childcare, domestic work. The list goes on and on. This is a crime that is actively happening here in the borders of our country. Let's talk about human trafficking in the state of South Carolina. So we have a state task force here that was mandated in 2012, and they utilize a collaborative approach. So the law that was passed in 2012 created this task force, among other things, and the law dictates that the task force has to submit annual reports, including findings and recommendations to the governor, the speaker of the House of Representatives, and the president of the Senate. The state task force encourages regional task forces across the South Carolina. Our area is represented by the Tri-County Human Trafficking Task Force, of which I am one of the two researchers and the co-chair of the research subcommittee. The state task force gets their prevalence data from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So these statistics are not a comprehensive report. They're just one way to get an understanding of the prevalence of this crime in our state. So from the hotline numbers, what they have found is that the top 5 counties in South Carolina for human trafficking are Horry, Charleston, Greenville, Richland, and Anderson. What we also found was the number of human trafficking cases reported here in the state of South Carolina. In 2012, we had 139 cases, 96 of which were sex trafficking, 22 cases were labor trafficking, 9 cases were sex and labor trafficking, and 12 were not specified. From this tip line data, the number of human trafficking victims reported in South Carolina was 179 for the year 2020. Looking at the court data, in 2020, 10 different defendants were charged with human trafficking, some with more than one charge, and totaling 13 charges of human trafficking in South Carolina state courts. From these charges, 3 defendants pled guilty to charges related to human trafficking. 5 charges were dismissed, one of which because the defendant pled to a different charge. And when this report was submitted in 2020, there were 75 pending human trafficking charges here in the state of South Carolina with 22 different defendants. So zeroing in even more, looking at human trafficking here in the Tri-County area, this is some of the data that I have personally collected. So I'm looking at law enforcement data. So I contact different law enforcement agencies in the Tri-County area to get a number of the human trafficking related arrests or calls for service. So the law was passed in 2012, but we didn't have our first case here in the Tri-County until 2016. Since 2016, there have been 22 human trafficking related arrests or calls for service in the Tri-County area, handled by four law enforcement agencies: North Charleston Police Department, Charleston County Sheriff's Office, Somerville Police Department, and Charleston Police Department. Of those 22 cases, there have been a total of 9 suspects and 20 victims. Regarding the victims, 60% were white, while 30% were Black. None were males, so that means 100% were females. The majority of them were discovered by Charleston County Sheriff's Office, followed closely by North Charleston Police Department. Regarding the suspects, 44% were white, while 56% were Black. 78% were male, meaning 22% were female. And the majority of human trafficking suspects were apprehended by the North Charleston Police Department, followed closely by Charleston County Sheriff's Office. Another way that we are assessing the frequency and prevalence of human trafficking in the Tri-County area is through a tool that we've added to our local jail. So here in Charleston at the Al Cannon Detention Center, inmates are given a series of questions to answer when they are booked into the jail. This is during a process called intake. And this is common for all incarceration facilities. Anytime they bring someone in, they ask them a series of questions for a number of reasons. So we had the Al Cannon Detention Center add 7 questions into their intake questionnaire to flag us if someone has potentially been booked into the jail as a human trafficking victim. If this person is flagged, then we reach out to a nonprofit organization here in Charleston County called the Formation Project, and they serve human trafficking victims. If they can, they go into the jail to make contact with this potential victim and offer them services. All of the individuals that are flagged receive a wristband that's very innocuous. It's just a black wristband that has a phone number on it, and the phone number is to the Formation Project. When they are released from the jail, they are told that they were flagged as a potential victim, and should they want any help, to call the number on the wristband. So the 7 questions that are incorporated include the following. Is someone else frequently in possession of your ID? Have you ever been arrested for prostitution? Have you ever been homeless or moved frequently in the last 12 months? Were you ever in foster care? Have you ever or are you currently working for someone who refuses to pay you what they promised or keeps the money that you made? Have you ever been or are you currently in a situation where you needed to trade sex for money, shelter, food, or drugs? And has anyone made you have sex or work when you did not want to do so? The jail assessment tool was implemented on April 6th of last year and is currently ongoing. So far, we have flagged 85 potential victims, 5 of which were interviewed by the Formation Project. 3 were identified as victims. 2 have contacted the Formation Project on their own, and 1 victim has begun receiving services. Based on these 6 individuals, we've developed a profile, and what we see is that the common profile is a white female arrested for a violent crime. She was not in possession of her ID. She was homeless or transient in the past 12 months. She was in foster care. She has worked for someone who has not paid her what they owed her, and she has needed to trade sex for money, shelter, food, or drugs. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is the effect that COVID-19 has had on trafficking victims. The pandemic generated conditions that increased the number of people who experienced vulnerabilities or at-risk factors to human trafficking. Additionally, due to school closures, some children lacked access to education, food, or shelter, just increasing the risk factors. Therefore, survivors of trafficking faced an increased risk of potential trafficking or potential re-victimization due to financial and emotional hardships during this crisis. A lot of survivors had to close down shops or leave jobs due to lockdowns, and some were pressured by their former traffickers when other employment options dried up and they needed money. Some survivors also had to sell their cell phones to purchase food, which even further isolated them from potential assistance from caseworkers. The pandemic also generated conditions that interrupted existing and planned anti-trafficking interventions. So looking at the effect on the traffickers, COVID-19 caused a global economic downturn and increased the number of individuals vulnerable to human trafficking, which we just discussed. And the traffickers adapted their existing tactics to take advantage of these unique circumstances created by the pandemic. There were reports from here in the United States, as well as the United Kingdom, that landlords were forcing their tenants, usually women, to have sex with them when the tenant could not pay rent. Additionally, traffickers sought to re-exploit survivors who became financially unstable and vulnerable to re-victimization. They also exploited situations where screening and identification of victims became even more difficult. As I mentioned above, many anti-trafficking efforts were stopped because of COVID closing off an avenue of help for victims. This just reinforced the message that a lot of traffickers use to keep their victims compliant, that there is no one out there to help you, no one is coming to save you. The traffickers also capitalized on the reduced capacity and shifting priorities of law enforcement, allowing them to continue their crimes uninterrupted. Additionally, pandemic mitigation efforts forced many people to shift online, including the traffickers. Online recruitment and grooming increased as children spent more time online for virtual learning due to school closures. And often this happened without parental supervision because the parents have to work. The U.S. National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported a 98.6% increase in online enticement reports between January and September of 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. Additionally, reports to the cyber tip line doubled to 1.6 million. So as you can see, COVID-19 just made more people vulnerable to be trafficked and simply helped the traffickers get away with their crimes. So this is it for this lecture. What you'll need to do this week is to take quiz 1 that accompanies this lecture. There's also a documentary for you to watch about human trafficking, and there will also be a second lecture posted that corresponds with quiz number 2. So please let me know if you have any questions, and I hope to hear from you. Have a great day.